Welcome to our webinar, Succeeding with Forecast Pro. In today's session, we're going to focus on overrides. Hello, and welcome to our webinar on Succeeding with Forecast Pro. Today we'll be discussing overrides. My name is James Berry, and I'm the Director of Training here at Forecast Pro. I've now been with the company 23 years, and I have helped hundreds of different companies work with Forecast Pro and get up and running with the software. And in today's webinar, hopefully I'll be able to teach you some new tips and techniques using our override functionality. Now, before we begin, let's go over a few housekeeping notes. This free webinar series on Succeeding with Forecast Pro is run once every quarter. Our next session will be in May, where we'll be discussing multivariate forecasting techniques, things like dynamic regression, as well as multivariate machine learning algorithms. So if you would like to sign up for that, my colleague Franklin will be pasting a link in the chat now. Also, all of our webinars are recorded and posted to our YouTube page. After today's session, we will upload the video and send everybody here attending a link so you can watch it later or share it with any of your colleagues. At the end of today's webinar, we will be taking your personal questions. So please use the Zoom functionality. There's a little chat button, which you can see here on the screen. Please go into the chat and type in any questions that you have. My colleague Franklin will be monitoring this throughout the entire session. And if you have any questions, please type them there. We'll try to answer them at the end. Now let's discuss today's agenda. We're going to start with an overview of overrides, how they work, and the different modes that we have available to us in Forecast Pro. Then what we'll do is move on to some examples, where we'll show you an example of the different modes that we have available to us to use for overrides. At the end, we'll wrap up with some conclusions to talk about what we've seen. And then finally, as mentioned, we'll take your questions. So again, please type them out as we go. So with that said, why don't we dive into today's webinar? All companies use overrides. Whether you are a single Forecast Pro user or a very large group with a multinational company, you understand your business, you understand your products, and you understand your customers. And we want to take that business intelligence and use it to adjust the forecast to make it better. And that is where the overrides come in. Now, you could get feedback from lots of different sources, whether that's management, sales, operations, your customers, or any other source. But what we want to do is try to consolidate that into our forecasting process. So whether you are a solo Forecast Pro user or you are a very large group getting feedback from multiple people, you want to make sure that you set up Forecast Pro in the optimal mode so that you can capture all of this feedback and generate the best forecast possible. We're going to start by focusing on the different override modes that are available in Forecast Pro. In our current version of Forecast Pro, there are three override modes. There's Standard Mode, Multi-Row Overrides Mode, and Multi-Row Incremental Mode. In the Standard Mode, you simply have a single line of forecasts that you will adjust directly. Whereas in the two multi-row modes, you will have multiple rows where you can make adjustments. In the multi-row overrides mode, the row order matters, whereas the lower rows take precedent. Whereas in the multi-row incremental mode, each row will be added together to come up with a final forecast. Let's look at these one at a time, starting with the Standard Mode. In this mode, we have a single row where we make all of our overrides. This is the current row. All adjustments will be made here. Any overrides that are made will be tracked and put into a change log that you can view to see how you actually got to this adjustment. Another important distinction of Standard Mode is that overrides are not locked by default. This means changes made throughout the hierarchy will affect them. This is different from the multi-row modes. So let's take a look at how this works in action in Forecast Pro itself. Here we are in Forecast Pro, and in this first example, as with all of the examples today, we're going to use our standard auto parts data, which installs with Forecast Pro. This consists of a 5-level hierarchy, starting with our grand total, followed by our region, then our product category, our SKUs, and our customers. So in this first example, we're going to look at the standard override mode. And when we look at the override grid, you can see there are 2 override rows. There's the statistical, showing our statistical values, and then there is the current row. This is the row that we will change directly when we want to actually make overrides. What you'll also notice is down at the bottom of the override grid, we have this new change log. It is turned on by default, but we can hide it if we want to, or we can turn it back on. And the change log will track all of the changes that we make in the current row. So how do we actually go about making changes? Well, the same way we would in any of the other override modes. We can either type in a value directly, or we can use the override buttons below. So let's start with entering a change directly. So here in April, you can see the current value is 817 units. If I were to set this to 900 units, I can go ahead and type my comment, set to 900. And when I go ahead and commit this, notice a bunch of things happen. The graph adjusts to show my 900. You will notice that the square next to the item does not turn red anymore, because these overrides, while they exist where I make the change, they are not permanent at any one node in the hierarchy. You can see here in my current override row that it now says 900, and I now have this information behind it when I click on this cell. So it says it was changed by myself on this date, as well as the comment that is associated with it. You'll also see all of the transactional information is shown down here in the change log. It says that I directly changed this node. I set the value to 900, whereas it was previously 817. It has my comment, the user who made this, the date and time it was made, whether it was locked, and whether this has already been committed or not. So I'm now going to keep track of all the changes that I make to any item, any node, any period, will all show up down here in this change log. And it is cumulative. So right now I set this to 900, but if I were to change this again, if I were to come in and change it to say 1000, and I'll update my comment, I'll say raised to 1000, I can go ahead and commit this, and notice I now have a second transaction in my change log. You can see I directly changed this to 1000. The previous value was 900. This is what was in the current row when I made that override. And you can see my comment, which is raised to 1,000 units, and all of the other information that I have stored with it. So now, as I make changes directly in this current row, any change that is made will be logged in the change log. And we will have transactions showing all changes and who made those changes and when. And all of this information will be stored here. Now, of course, because I only have one row to work, if I ever wanted to restore back to my statistical, I can. That's what this button here is for. It allows me to restore to the baseline. So if I go ahead and click on this, you can see it restores me back to my statistical forecast. And once again, I get a new transaction that I directly changed back to this value from my previous of 1000. And all of that information is here as well. Now this is me making changes directly, obviously, but I can use our standard buttons just as in any of the other override modes where I have my percent, increment, and my value boxes. So how would this work? Again, let's take a look. Here, if I came in and said, look, I'm going to run a promotion in the summer and I want to increase it by 25%, I can highlight in the current row the 3 months that I want to change. I can use my percent button, go ahead and click on this. You can see it shows my proposed changes. I'm going to go ahead and type in my comment, which is raised summer 25%. And I'll go ahead and commit this. And you will see now for each cell, there is a transaction down here in the change log showing what I have done. And it has my percentage changes here. Let me go to a new item or customer here, and I can show you the increment button. So once again, if I wanted to raise something, say 100 units per month, I could highlight March and April, hit the increment button, you'll see it raises each 100. I'll type in my comment, raised 100 per month, and go ahead and commit this. And you'll see it will make my changes. And again, on each cell, it has my change has been marked down here in my change log. And finally, with our value button, just as before, again, if I wanted to highlight, say, the second half of the year, you will see the sum. It says it's 1,200 units. If I said, look, I want to sell 1,500 over the second half of the year, I can come in and type in 1,500, hit the value box here. You can see it proportionally raises each up, so it sums to 1,500. Type in my comment, set second half of year to 1,500 total. And I can go ahead and commit this. And you will see, again, for each cell, it has a transaction put in here. So I'm now going to make changes directly in this current cell. And it's keeping track of all of the changes that I have made. Now, this is important, especially if we're going to work in any kind of collaborative environment. We are also logging what user made these changes. So for instance, if I were to come up here to this customer and click, you can see there are some adjustments over here. And my colleague Franklin has actually made these adjustments previously. So I can actually see here are some changes that Franklin has made in this customer. So June, July, you can see he said that he's raised it 25% for a summer promotion. But if I were to come in here and say, actually, you know what, June, this is too high. We can only do 300 total in June. So I can come over here and type in 300 units and type in my own comment and say lowered to 300. And I can commit this. And now you will see that I have two transactions. I've changed the forecast to 300, but I still have visibility into the previous changes that Franklin has made. So I have Franklin's information here, but I actually went ahead and changed that myself directly. So I'm able to make changes directly, but I do not lose visibility into any previous changes that have been made for this given period. So while I'm making changes in a single row, we still have visibility into previous changes that were made there, and we have access to them if I wanted to return to them. Now, in addition to seeing any transaction for a given period on a given item here in the override grid itself, we also have a global override transaction report, which we can also view. You can see here, this is showing all items with all transactions that have been made, and this is filterable. Now, one way to use this is we can actually go to display, and instead of saying all items, we can actually say all dates for the current item that I am on. So now I can actually see all of the transactions for this given item, and it will adjust depending upon which item I actually go about clicking on. So I can actually come up here and click around, and in addition to seeing here's the transactions for the given month that I have clicked on, here are all of the transactions that have been applied to this given node in the hierarchy, which will adjust as I move around the system. So I'm able to actually see not just detailed here in the override grid, I can also see this override report. And so I can actually view and focus in on this particular item as I go if I wanted to see more information over time. Now let's talk about hierarchy reconciliation. I've come over here in my hierarchy to the SKU that has 5 customers. And if we look at July of 2026, I have set the override to 100 units for each of my 5 customers. And what that means is when I come up here to the SKU total, you can see that the total value is 500. Now, when I look at the transactions, you can see all 5 of the overrides that were made, and you can see they say that they are indirect. So I didn't directly adjust this SKU, but changes that were made indirectly down below have summed to this 500 over here. So you can see that this is my value of 500. Now, one key thing to understand in this mode is there are now locked and unlocked overrides. The default behavior is for all overrides to be unlocked. And what that means is if I come over here to the SKU total, which is now 500, because once again, each of my 5 customers is set to 100. if I were to change the total and raise it 10%, that would make this 550. I'll set my comment. We'll say raised additional 10%. And I can go ahead and commit this. What you'll see is the skew will now be 550. And you'll see I have a transaction that I directly changed the skew to 550 from 500. And what that means is I'm now proportionally push this down to each of the customers. So now when I look at the customer, you will see that I directly changed it to 100, but indirectly above I changed from 500 to 550, which raised this 10%. And so across the board, each of the customers is now 110 units. So now the default behavior in our standard mode is that no overrides are locked. I can make an override at any level of the hierarchy, and it will push down and up the hierarchy proportionally, and it will change the final values of any of my lower or higher level items, even if they already have overrides in there. This is different from the other two modes where we have all of the overrides are locked by default. Now we can replicate that in this mode. I have done the same exercise on this new skew, where once again we have 5 customers, and I have set July and all 5 customers to 100. So we can see once again that the skew total is 500. But what I could do when I make these overrides is, instead of keeping them unlocked, when I make this change, I can actually see there is a lock button, and I can go ahead and click on this, and this will lock this override. And you can see the square next to the item has turned red. Red indicates that there is an override and it is locked here. And I can do the same thing to all of my other customers. So I can come over here and lock this 100 on all of these. And now what that means is you can see the skew total has now turned red. It is also locked. It will not allow me to make any changes here. So if I were to try to change this to 550, you can't see this on my screen, but it will not allow me to make any changes here. And you can see all of the buttons are grayed out because I have now locked all the customers underneath it. So it simply will not allow me to make a change. So in this standard override mode, the default behavior is for any override that you make to be unlocked and can be changed if additional overrides are made above or below. But I do have the ability to explicitly lock these forecasts so that when I make a change above or below, it will not change them at all. So whereas the other modes that we will see, every override is locked by default and cannot be changed. Here in the standard override mode, you have a choice. Do I want the overrides to be open and unlocked so that they can be changed? Or do I want to lock these forecasts such that any changes above or below will not affect them? But I have this choice in the standard override mode. So let's discuss some of the advantages of the standard mode. The first is that it is a much simpler mode. We have a single override row where all changes are made, and we keep track of these changes in our change log. This also gives us the ability to see changes at different hierarchy levels. It's very easy now to click on groups or end items and see all of the overrides that have been made at other levels that affect the final forecast here. Also important is that the overrides themselves are not explicitly locked. You have control over whether an override is locked or unlocked, giving you the ability to make changes at multiple override levels and whether or not they actually affect other overrides as well. So now that we've looked at the standard mode, let's move on to the multi-row modes, starting with the multi-row override mode. As you can see, unlike the standard mode, we have multiple override rows where we can make changes. Now, each of these rows will be labeled for a person or group of people. This way, when we're working in a collaborative environment, we can quickly and easily see who has been making which changes. And then the row order itself actually matters, because the lower rows take precedence over the rows above them, giving us the opportunity to assign who has final say in the forecast. So with that said, let's take a look at this in Forecast Pro itself. Now here in our second example, we're going to look at the multi-row override functionality. Now this, in previous versions of Forecast Pro, was the default methodology. So here, if we look at our override grid, you can see our top row is our statistical, just as with the standard mode. But we then have multiple override rows where we can make changes to the forecast, followed by a final forecast that will reflect all of the changes that we have made. So here you can see that I have 3 override rows, and I have named them Sales, Demand Planner, and Management. The advantage of this mode is that we have visibility into who's making the changes directly. You will notice we do not have a change log at the bottom. We don't need that because we're actually going to see the overrides in place in these override rows themselves. So as before, if I wanted to make a change, again, the easiest way to make a change is directly change it. I can type in 900 here in sales and type in my comment, set to 900, just like I did in the standard mode. And when I commit this, you will see it will make a change. You can see that the final forecast now reflects that change. It has become 900 units. You can also see that it has a comment associated with it, and all of the information that we would see in the change log in the standard view, we can see by hovering our mouse over. You can see we set this to 900. You can see the comment. We can see who updated it, as well as the date and time that it was updated. So we can see this. You will also notice that over in the override grid itself, the square next to the item turned red. That red indicates that there is an override here and it is locked, just like we saw in the standard mode. In the override multi-row view, all of the overrides are locked by default and they simply cannot be unlocked. That is why the square next to the item turns red, because it indicates that there is an override and it is locked. As with the other mode, we have the ability to do percent, increment, and value changes. However, we also have this option to make it a formula or not. In the standard mode, all of the overrides are stored as hard values, whereas in these multi-row modes, we can choose between a hard value and a formula. The difference between those, of course, is if I come over here and I say, look, July and August, I'm going to increase it 25%. We need to pick which row it goes into. Sales, demand planning, or management. We'll put this into the sales row. Again, in the standard mode, we only have a single row to make changes to, but here in the multi-rows, we need to pick which row it goes into. So I'll go ahead and put my change, and you'll see it pops up here as a proposed change. I raised it 25%. But I have an option to store this either as a hard number or a formula. The default is a hard number. If I double click here in the cell, you can see here is the value. It is a hard number here. In the standard mode, everything is stored as a hard number. But in the multi-row modes, we actually can choose between a hard number and a formula. Why does that matter? Well, again, a truism forecasting is that the further out in time I go, the less accurate my forecasts tend to be. So while I'm forecasting out here 6 months from now in July, as I move closer to July, I would expect my forecast for July to get better. I don't expect it to change dramatically. Right now it's 681. If I come back next month and it's 2,000, that would be a problem. But I do expect it to change slightly for the better. And so if my assumption is I'm going to run this summer promotion, it's going to increase demand by 25%, well, what I can do is I can actually choose formula as an option before I make one of these changes and hit the percent button. And now this is being stored as a formula, which is the baseline forecast times 1.25. And so if I come over here and make these changes, again, I'll type in my comment, raised 25%, and commit this. Now this is a formula versus a hard number, which is what happens in the standard modes. And so when I come back next month, there'll be a new statistical forecast for July and August, and these overrides will adjust to be 25% more. So this gives me the option to do either a hard number or a formula when I'm making these changes, whereas in the standard mode, these are hard numbers only. It's just a limitation in that mode. The other difference, of course, is if I make multiple changes. The demand planner can come over here and say, you know what, this July forecast of 852, that's too little. I want this to be 975. And we'll just say set to 975. And when I go ahead and commit this, you can see the final forecast becomes 975. The lower rows take precedent over the rows above them. And so when I'm allowing multiple people to make changes, I can set who takes priority. The demand planner will overwrite sales, and management will overwrite all three of these. Whereas in the standard mode, everyone has access to the final forecast, and it's the last person to make a change who has the final say. Whereas in this multi-row mode, we have the ability to dictate who has the final say by ordering the rows in this particular order. Also, I do see, here's what sales made and here's what the demand planner says. We see this in place as opposed to looking at the change log, which we would see in the standard mode. So again, we do have the ability to have multiple rows and we have visibility into it. We can dictate whether these are formulas or hard numbers, and we can dictate who has preferences, whereas the standard mode, it is just last person to make a change. They're the change that we will use. Now, what about reconciliation? Again, we are looking at the same situation we saw with the standard mode, where I have 5 customers and I have set July to 100 units each for each of the customers, and up here at the SKU level, you can see the final forecast is 500. Now we have no visibility in place of who made these changes or how. So that's one of the disadvantages here. In the standard mode, the change log will show all of the changes that were made that got us to this 500. Here in the multi-row view, we don't have that visibility. We see the final forecast of 500, but we don't know how we got here. Also, as we talked about, all of the overrides in the multi-rows are locked, which means we cannot make changes at these higher levels. If we attempt it, so if I were to try to set this to 550, like we did before, and I try to commit this, I will get an error message telling me that there is a conflicting override of 550 here at the SKU in July, and it was removed. So I can try making changes, but it will actually tell me that this is locked. So I don't have the ability to make changes just like in the standard mode, but it does come up with a warning, and it is kind of harder to understand where these changes have been made. So once again, in the multi-row modes, all overrides are locked by default, which means if I make a change, no matter what level, that change is locked. Whereas in the standard mode, I have the ability to choose whether that override is locked or not. So let's recap some of the benefits of multi-row override mode. The first is the easy visibility into who made what change. Because each person or group of people has their own row, we can quickly and easily see who has made changes to any item itself. This also allows us to assign priority of who gets the final say when making overrides, unlike in the standard mode where it's just the last person who made a change gets the final say. And because all of the overrides are intrinsically locked, we will always reconcile our hierarchy, and we will not allow people to make changes that will affect other overrides that have already been made. So finally, let's look at the multi-row incremental mode. Again, this is a multi-row mode, so we have multiple rows where we're making overrides. However, unlike the multi-row override mode, in multi-row incremental row, each row isn't assigned to a person or a group of people, but simply a driver that is affecting our business. And it is the sum of all of our overrides that become the final forecast itself. So let's take a look at this in Forecast Pro. Now here in our third mode, we're looking at multi-rows, but in an incremental adjustment mode. What that means is that once again, we have our statistical forecast on top, we have multiple override rows, and our final forecast down here at the bottom. But in this case, instead of assigning the rows to people or groups of people, These rows are actually acting as drivers of information that is impacting our business and our forecast. So for example, here in my data set, I have set 2 rows, which is marketing campaigns and back orders. And what happens, instead of making a override that directly affects the final forecast, basically Forecast Pro is going to add up the statistical plus all of the overrides that are made here to come up with the final forecast. So what does that look like? So once again, if I come over here to April and I say we have our marketing campaign, if I actually type in 100 units here, and again, we'll type our comments, we'll say increased 100 units. Unlike in the override mode, where the final forecast will become 100, here in the incremental mode, we will add 100 to the statistical. So I go ahead and commit this, and you can see the final forecast becomes 917. So here, each of these rows are drivers that are impacting our business. And as with the other multi-row override mode, you will see that the square turns red because this is a locked forecast. Unlike the standard mode, which gives you the opportunity to lock or unlock this is a locked override that will not be changed. So what we're doing here is actually adding information. So for instance, again, if I came over to my July and August and said I wanted to run my promotion and increase it by 50%, I can go ahead and do this. I can put this into my marketing campaign row. You will see it doesn't put a value, it simply adds 50% to each. And we'll say raised 50%. And now, again, we add up the statistical plus the adjustments to get the final forecast. As with the multi-row override mode, we can also choose whether these adjustments are hard numbers or formulas. So you can see here, again, the default is a hard number. This is storing a hard number. But if I wanted to, I could check the formula box, push my button again, commit this, and you will see this is now storing the baseline times 0.5, which gives me my information. Also, like the multi-row override mode, I don't directly see information down here like I do in the standard mode with the change log. I have to hover my mouse over the cell to see the change, the comment, the date, time, and user who has made these changes. So we can see that down here. Now, how would this work if we have multiples? I can come over here to this other customer where we have a very common example. Once again, I have come over here. If I look at my comment for this, you can see that I have raised the summer, so June, July, and August, by 50% because I'm running a multimedia marketing campaign. But I have a second row for my back orders, and if I look at my comment here, you can see that because of my back orders, I'm down 200 units per month for April, May, and June. And so here in April, where I start with 234, I minus 200 for my back order, I'm down to 34 units total for my forecast. Same thing here with May, 279 minus 200 for my back order, I'm at 79. But here in June, where I have 2 going on at the same time, unlike the override mode, where one takes precedent over the other, here we are simply adding both of them together. So we start with 202, we add 101, that gets us to 303 point something, which will round us to 304, minus 200, that gets us to 104. So the final forecast is a reflection of everything added up in the column above it. So unlike with the override mode, where one row takes precedent over the other, here it is the combination of everything added together to get us our final forecast at the bottom below. If this is how you think in your company, that we want to have multiple rows for multiple drivers that are affecting our business, and we want the combination of all of them at once, this would be the mode for you. Let's also look at the reconciliation. Once again, I have done the same thing where I have my SKU and my 5 customers. Now I have set the forecast to 100, but the way I have to actually do that if you see, it's actually, I needed to do a formula. It's actually difficult in this incremental mode to get to a hard fixed value. You actually have to use formulas to do this. So you can see, I want this to equal 100. So if you look at my formula, it's 100 minus whatever is in the statistical. So I needed 91 additional plus 9. That gets me to 100. You can see over here I was selling 6, so I need 94 more to get me to 100. When we look at some of these, 63 to 33, I actually need to go negative. This item was 240. I need to subtract off 140 to get to 100. So once again, I have done the same thing where I've set July to 100 at each of these, which means, of course, when I come up here to my SKU, it shows me my final forecast is 500. Just like with the multi-row overrides, again, I don't have any visibility to how I got this 500. Unlike in the standard mode where we have the change log, I don't have any visibility into that. But similar to the override mode, if we did my formula, which equals 550 minus the statistical to figure out what we want here, you can see I would need to add 226, which would try to get us to that 550 to raise us 10%. Just like with the multi-row overrides, it's not going to let me. It's going to give me an error saying that we can't make a change because once again, all of the overrides I have made down below at the customers are locked by default. So when they are locked, I cannot make a change at a group above. And if I did make a change, it would not affect them below. So again, both multi-row modes, whether it's multi-row override or multi-row incremental, the overrides are locked by default and cannot be changed. Whereas in the standard mode, I have the option to have them locked or unlocked. So to recap some of the advantages of multi-row incremental mode, this allows us to have multiple drivers visible and making changes all at the same time. So if we have all of these drivers that are affecting our business and some of them overlap, allowing us to have multiple impacts that add up and accumulate can be very beneficial. It also makes it easier to add or subtract values directly in the override grid rather than having to use the formula buttons that we see below. It is important to note that this mode is used primarily in the pharmaceutical industry. Now, it is by no means exclusive to that, but if you are in a pharma company, this is kind of how you think about making overrides, and this mode is just sort of what you would think of as the default. But that doesn't mean that if you're in a different company, you couldn't use it. It's just whether you think that this is the way that you want to make adjustments. So now that we have seen all three modes, how do we decide which mode to use? One of the most important decisions when choosing the override modes is whether or not you're going to rearrange the hierarchy within Forecast Pro and make overrides in multiple hierarchies. If you're going to rearrange the hierarchy, the standard mode should be your number one choice. This is the easiest to work with when working in alternative hierarchies. Now, in the two multi-row modes, you can rearrange the hierarchy and make adjustments, but it is a much more difficult process. Let's take a look at this in Forecast Pro. So let's look at working in an alternative hierarchy here in Forecast Pro. We will look at both the standard mode as well as the multi-row mode and the differences between them. Now here in the standard mode, you can see here's my example where I have all of my overrides currently sitting in my default hierarchy. If I were to right-click on the hierarchy, I can come over here and say Hierarchy Reorder, and I can change the order of my hierarchy. In this case, I'm simply going to move Customer above SKU and see what happens. I'll get a warning saying I'm going to lock the statistical forecast and say OK. Now you can see, once this has reordered, I still have adjustments in my current row, and I have access to all of those adjustments in my change log. Now they are all indirect because of course they were made in alternative hierarchies, but all of the final forecasts are still here. I have access to all the changes that were made, and I can see them, and I can continue to make changes in this new hierarchy. And so I could flip around my hierarchy as much as I want, and it simply doesn't affect this because all of the changes are made in this current row, and I have access to all of those changes and how I got there in my change log. So there is a great advantage to working in the standard mode if you're going to be working in alternative hierarchies. Now here we are in the multi-row override mode. Once again, we still have a whole bunch of overrides over here. Now I can reorder my hierarchy the same way. I can right-click on the hierarchy and come over here and say reorder. And once again, I'll move the customer above SKU, just like I did in the standard mode. I'll get my warning, but I have an additional warning that is going to create this inherited override row. And what does that mean? What that means is now in my multi-row, I still have all of my in-place rows, sales, demand planner, and management, but I have this new inherited overrides row. And this represents the adjustments that were made in previous hierarchies. Now I can come in and make additional changes in this new hierarchy structure, right? If I come over here to May and I set this to say 1500 units and set my comment set to 1500, I can commit this. And I now am able to make changes in this altered hierarchy. However, I do lose visibility. How did I get this number? I don't have the changelog down below, so I can't see that. It also becomes more difficult when I move through time next month, because see what I've now created are what we call override sets. Here in this dialog box, we can actually see the previous override sets, and you can see I currently have 2 in this project. I have 1 in our default hierarchy, which we call 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I have a second override set in my hierarchy of 1, 2, 3, 5, 4, where I rearranged the hierarchy. Now this provides me a roadmap when I come back next month of what will happen. I will load in new historical data, will return to the default hierarchy, but none of my overrides will load automatically. It will simply give me the option to pick which set I want to work on. And I can load set number 1, review, make more changes, flip the hierarchy, load set number 2, etc. But this is a very complex process and it adds a lot of friction when working in multiple override sets. And so while it is possible to use the multi-rows and rearrange the hierarchy and make overrides in different hierarchies, it becomes much more difficult to keep track of what override was made, how I got there, and how to replicate that process the following month. So while the standard mode is much more direct, everything loads because they are just kind of sitting there, and we have information about them in the changelog, here in the multi-row sets, you get lots of override sets and it becomes much more difficult. So while it is possible, it is a bit more difficult to use. Okay, what if we're going to work with external drivers that are affecting our business? Well, obviously, in this case, the multi-row incremental would be the right choice. That is what it's designed for. You can do it with the multi-row overrides, where you can make some adjustments, but it's not ideal. But here, with the standard mode, this is not what you want. Because we have only a single row to make changes, standard mode is not the way to go. What if we're working in a collaborative environment with multiple Forecast Pro users? We'll start with the project collaboration. In this case, standard mode and multi-row override mode are both viable options. It is important to note that multi-row incremental mode is not supported in project collaboration. So if this is something you're going to use, incremental mode is not for you. Now deciding between the two will really come down to how am I going to work in this project collaboration and how am I going to set up the data. So again, all the decisions we've seen before, this is where we would make those choices. What about working with multiple Forecast Pro users with Excel collaboration? Again, same options here. Standard mode and multi-row override mode are perfectly viable. The incremental mode simply is not supported here. So once again, it really depends on how am I going to set up my Excel collaboration process and what will work best for me. Okay, so let's wrap up some of the things that we've seen in today's webinar. The first is that any company using Forecast Pro will have the need to use our override functionality. People get feedback from their colleagues in their company, and they want to apply your own business knowledge to make the forecast better, and that's where the overrides come in. Now, as we've seen, there are multiple override modes that you can use. In our case, there are 3 different modes. And depending upon your company and what you think is best for you, you want to use the methodology that will work best. We talked about the pros and cons of the 3 different types of modes that we have, and hopefully this will help you in making your decisions. And the reason we have all three of these modes is because there is no best mode. You need to choose what you think will work best for your company. Now, one thing to note is that we used Forecast Pro Track version 8.3. This is where the standard mode has been introduced, and any of you who are up to date with your software support will be entitled to this version of the software, so you'll have access to all three versions of the override modes. If you would like to see that mode or any of the modes in more detail, we do offer free live demos of Forecast Pro. These would be 60 to 90 minutes, and we can use your real data. So if you would like to see these modes in action with your data, please reach out and we'd be happy to help you. If you already have Forecast Pro and you would like to get a more in-depth training, that's obviously where I come in since I am the director of training, and I'd be happy to help you with additional training if you'd like to see any of the override modes or any other functionality that is available in Forecast Pro. Now, to reiterate something we discussed in the intro, these webinars are run once every quarter, and again, our next session will be in May talking about multivariate modeling. If you would like to sign up for that, again, my colleague Franklin will post the link where you can sign up for the webinar. Or if you want to attend any other future event that we offer, including seminars on modeling, both in person and online, or again, live training, you can go ahead and reach out on our website at forecastpro.com/events, or you can reach out directly to me via email, and I'd be happy to discuss any of your needs and what you think would work best for you. And so finally, we're going to move on to your questions. But as I mentioned in the introduction, if you do have any questions about these modes, please use the Zoom chat right now, enter your questions, and we'll try to answer them as best we can. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into your questions.